This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
This is where it all started out. This is a map of the United States. This happens to show the death rate from colorectal cancer. And I'm showing it mainly because it tells the story in a pictorial way. If you look at the northeastern part of the United States, you'll see all these red areas. These are the areas where the death rates are highest from colorectal cancer. And if you get below the Mason-Dixon line, which runs through the middle of America from the Chesapeake Bay to Morro Bay in California, you'll see that most of the areas are blue, which are areas that are areas of low mortality from the disease. The black lines show how much sunlight there is, and as you can see in the south, particularly Arizona, New Mexico, and the western parts of Texas, there are 500 units of sunlight each year. These are gram calories per square centimeter per day. And in the northern part of the country, particularly the northeast, they are very low, down to 300 or so. And that's where you see the most concentration of red areas. The reason it's concentrated in the northeast versus the northwest is because there's a thicker ozone layer in the northeast. There is more air pollution from the products of combustion of high sulfur coal, and the weather is colder. This all led to a review of classical theories of cancer, and we've had a theory since 1902, it came from Boveri, that mutations were the cause of cancer. And they are a factor in cancer. Later studies refined that a bit, new models emerged in the 1980s, and more recently a mini-hit theory emerged that it has to be a lot of damage to the DNA to produce cancer. But what really hasn't gotten much attention is and maybe this is a good time for it on the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin, is the concept of micro-Darwinian carcinogenesis. A mouthful, but just all it means is that when there's vitamin D deficiency, the cells lose their contact with one another. This unleashes the natural selection process that is the driver of most biology, and that even a small percentage advantage in growth or aggressiveness of a cell will lead to its ultimately completely taking over a tissue compartment. It's a little part of a tissue where a cancer arises, and ultimately taking over the whole tissue, and if left unchecked, the whole person. Now that doesn't begin as long as there are tight junctions and adherent junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions, which are the structures that keep our cells stuck together and allow them to communicate with each other. These are dependent on vitamin D. When the vitamin D level is low, people that aren't out in the sun may be working shift work, maybe they're using sunscreens whenever they're in the sun, or they're just avoiding it. These tight junctions tend to be diminished, and ultimately, if they get quite low in vitamin D, such as during the middle of winter, they can be lost. And when that happens, the cells pull apart, and they have the potential for being autonomous. And this is a closer look at these things. They are modified from cilia. You may remember from high school looking at a protozoan and seeing that there are these cilia that stick out from it that are used for propulsion, but they're also good for sticking cells together, and we still have them after all these millions of years of life on Earth. And these are the different kinds of structures that stick the cells together. My favorite is the third one down, the 7-pass transmembrane flamingo cadherin. And when you have a lot of vitamin D, then you have something like that that's holding those cells together to the degree that it's impossible for them to compete. That inhibits natural selection. But the reality is any of these adherins will cause the cells to stick to one another, and when they do that, they don't evolve into harmful structures that we call cancer. To look at it a little more closely, these are the hinges, and actually this is the coupling between two cells looked at ultramicroscopically, and we see that it's made up of two compounds. One is cadherin. Ca stands for calcium, D for vitamin D. Herin means it's a glue. And the other is calcium. And you have to have both present in order for the cells to stick to each other well. Great deficiency of vitamin D or of calcium causes loss of these junctions. They're sucked back into the cells in a process known as endocytosis, and the cells go back to a program that is rather individualistic, a single cell type of program, in addition to maybe having a little bit of the a cooperative program that's necessary for life as a multicellular organism. Now here's some genes that are affected by vitamin D. The one that I just showed you was E-cadherin, the third on this list. It's upregulated 12-fold by a standard dose of a vitamin D metabolite. So it's a pretty important controller of the glue between the cells. Many scientists are interested in these other compounds, or some of them aren't even characterized yet chemically, but that help prevent cancer. And the research is going on intensively in this field to help determine which of 10 different mechanisms is the most important one needed for vitamin D to prevent cancer. There are now 3,000 studies, laboratory studies, of the effect of vitamin D on risk of cancer, 275 epidemiological studies, and we're just beginning to understand the reasons, although we know the effects. The result of all this is what we're calling the dynamite theory of cancer. And the idea is that there are these steps in cancer that each allow a possibility of intervention. Previously we had a model that just had the I and the O and the M. The initiation, which is a mutation, the overgrowth, which is when the cells get out of control and become large enough for a clinically detectable tumor, and the M, which means spread of the tumor or metastasis. But the new research adds a new layer at the beginning, a new step called disjunction. A good way to remember it is that it starts with a D. Vitamin D prevents disjunction. Disjunction is the uncoupling of the cells, and once that occurs, the other stages are enabled. If it doesn't occur, all the following stages will not occur. So vitamin D has the capability of blocking the entire sequence leading to cancer in most tissues at the very first stage, the D stage. And up to now, we haven't had that perception, that perspective, or really ability to intervene. Now we do. We'll go on and take a look at these stages in a little more depth. Under ordinary circumstances, the cells look kind of like a brick wall almost. They're stuck together. The mortar is these cadherins. You can see in the upper figure here that cadherins, these little pink structures, are holding those cells tightly together. And as long as that happens, a person will go through life, generally speaking, unless they do something extremely dangerous, such as smoking or consume very excessive amounts of alcohol, without developing cancer. But if those are lost, the phenomenon is called disjunction, and that's when the junctions between the cells are lost. Normally epithelial tissue, which is only 2% of body mass, but makes up 98% of cancer, undergoes this process in the absence of vitamin D that you're seeing here. This is disappearance of the tight junctions, and now they're reappearing under vitamin D's influence. This model shows under influence of vitamin D, if the cells maintain their vitamin D receptor, which is the way that cells respond to vitamin D, then you'll see them recoalesce, and this offers the help of stopping the growth of tumor cells that express vitamin D receptor, which is most tumor cells in the stages that we encounter them clinically. After this comes the stage of initiation. This is the famous stage that we all know about, the famous mutation phenomenon, and who hasn't thought of mutation as a factor in life, and it does happen. Its main importance is that it introduces variation. It doesn't actually, we're now realizing, require mutation to do this, because the reproduction of DNA is imperfect. And if the cells are reproducing rapidly enough, there isn't time for fixing errors as a result of the replication, and the effective mutation occurs without even an external stimulus. So a carcinogen as such need not be present. Merely the process of reproduction of the cells, particularly at an accelerated pace, which occurs in deficiency of vitamin D or calcium, is enough to produce the variation. And once variation occurs, we know on a Darwinian way of looking at the world that there will be natural selection. And cells vary across a normal distribution in their ability to reproduce. Some reproduce in the intestine, for example, in a matter of 24 hours. Some take 4 days. Well, if the cells are not bound tightly to each other, the ones that can reproduce in 24 hours will very quickly dominate the whole tissue compartment, ultimately the whole organ, ultimately, if left alone, much of the individual's structure. But if this is inhibited at the outset by the vitamin D or potentially stopped in the process, we won't see this natural selection occurring. It's an amazingly swift phenomenon if the reproduction is quick enough. After that, we get to the stage of overgrowth, and this is when the cells just begin to reproduce at a rate because a clone has been selected, which is really rapidly reproductive, and it's starting to take over. We've calculated that only a 1% selective advantage is enough in 9,000 generations to cause one cell that has the advantage to take over the whole tissue compartment. And that 9,000 generations occurs in about 20 years at a normal quiescent rate. In extreme vitamin D deficiency, that can be reduced to just a few years. The next step is that when these cells begin to aggregate, this crowd of cells, these overgrown cells, ultimately there isn't room for them, and some of them at the periphery are starved for essential amino acids. And these are amino acids that our human cells can't make. However, they are stored in the membrane surrounding almost all epithelial tissues and actually make up the membrane. Well, these cells, hungry, rapidly reproducing, aggressive, have expressed various compounds that allow them to dissolve the basement membrane, as it's called. And once that happens, some of the cells pop through, and that's when the formal definition of malignancy begins. And that's when the real threat begins, because then these cells are not only in the tissue compartment, but can spread to the rest of the organ, ultimately to other parts of the body. And how it works is that it goes through a so-called stromal phase, where the invaders, these newly evolved cells that have been selected so far for aggression and rapid reproduction, get down into the understructure of below each epithelial layer in the body. And almost all of our body is covered in one way or another, inside or out, with an epithelial layer. And they invade the housekeeping cells beneath, and they reestablish or they establish themselves in that area. At this point, we could probably reestablish the tight junctions with adequate vitamin D. There's good evidence for that. And it might just stop at that point, which would simplify cancer surgery and cancer treatment in general. But if nothing is done, then the lymphatic entry phase begins, and some of these cells get into the lymphatic circulation, which is a slow-moving traffic-bearing system in the body, slow-moving but effective, that can move them essentially anywhere. They can end up in the lymph nodes where they get stuck and the lymph node becomes swollen, and that's clinically detectable. In the breast, it's an underarm lymph node typically. And sometimes they'll stay there for quite some time. But then ultimately, some of them will migrate through this plumbing system and unfortunately take up residence in a remote tissue, such as the brain or the lungs or the liver. And that's a really terrible consequence, because these cells are selected for their rapid reproduction and aggressiveness, and the cells in the host tissue, which they invade, are not selected for that. And so the invading cells rapidly can overcome the defenders and take over the organ that's invaded. Well, the next step is metastasis, and we're all familiar with this. Anyone that has ever had cancer, has had a relative with it, where the cancer spreads, that's the M phase. That is preventable if we could prevent any of the preceding stages. And then following that, two new stages that we've introduced. One is called involution, and this is when the malignant cells move into a phase where they're just not growing anymore. And oddly enough, this happens during the summer in many places in the world. It's been observed in Norway, where the cancers are not being diagnosed in the summer because they're quiescent. When winter comes along, then the cancers are activated and involution is lost. But this involution could potentially be a lifelong state, and that's finally the final stage, which is transition, where the cell is converted to being quite quiescent. Malignancy is a background concern. The chances are, if the person persists with the transitional phase, they will not die of cancer. They'll die of some other cause at the right time in their life and not prematurely. This requires no less than 40 to 60 nanograms per ml, the standard amount of 25-hydroxyvitamin D. So to wrap it up, these are the stages. We now know there are 7 stages of cancer rather than the 3 that we knew about before the new model. And that probably most importantly, we know that the first one, disjunction, is quite readily preventable by maintaining adequate levels of vitamin D and calcium. And once we stop that from happening, then this whole cascade that follows, all the other letters in this alphabet soup, do not occur, and we're not going to have cancer, except for cancers that are caused by smoking or very excessive intake of alcohol. Thank you very much. We hope you learned something more about vitamin D that will inspire you to seek more information about it. It's a burgeoning field. There's a lot to learn. Thank you.